This is Idiot with a Library Card, a podcast about books and libraries, which are now just buildings I drive by and longingly sigh. And if you're wondering what that sounds like, it's something like this. So today I will be talking about a historical novel called Mutiny on the Bounty. This book is authored by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall. It is about a real-life event. That event is a mutiny on a ship called the Bounty. This book is the first of a trilogy. I don't think I'll be doing any other shows about the other two, though, and I will get into that as I do the show. I think it will be obvious why. I'll start by saying, overall, I did not like this book. It's not terrible, and thank God for that, because it's really hard to do a show about a bad book. One, unlike getting through like a movie that's not good, which is like 2 hours, sometimes getting through a book that's not good is not only longer, because books obviously take longer to consume, but as you get less interested in the book, it then just becomes harder to read, and you get bored and you stop more often, where a bad movie, just you can almost tune out a little bit and just let it pass by. So luckily, as much as I don't like this book and will not be recommending it, I will say that it's not unreadable. It has some interesting parts and some interesting conflicts, but it's to me not a top-notch book. I didn't enjoy the story or the conflicts or the philosophy and psychological endeavors it goes into. So to start with, I was actually excited. When I read the first two chapters, I thought this book was going to be really interesting. And the first two chapters are very well written to set up what I found out later is to set up the questions that the trilogy will be answering, and not so much just this book. What it sets up is a comparison of cultures, mostly the English and Tahiti culture, and more broadly, and I don't love using this word, but it's going to come in later, sort of the Western culture and the savage culture. And when I use the word savage, I mean the savage culture described by Rousseau, a noble savage culture, which in some ways is better than the Western European culture. In his view, is ultimately better than the Western European culture, less restrictive, more free, and the people are happier. And where it felt like this was going to be explored was in the criminal justice law realm. And you get a lot of explanation of English law, especially English sea law. The problem is on the other side, this boat goes to Tahiti, and before the mutiny and then after the mutiny, the parties go to Tahiti. And I'll get into the story because it's important for other points of why I didn't like this book. I thought at some point some Tahitian was going to break a rule, and we were going to be able to see how the Tahitians, and I hope I'm saying that right, handled that issue, but that never comes up. And the first two chapters really set that up, and I like political philosophy, and I was interested in seeing the different ways to handle taboos and laws being violated. And it's promised and promised and promised, and it never happens. In this book, at least. It may happen in the other two, and it would be interesting to see, but again, I didn't like this book enough to justify reading the other two. My other issue with this book, and I have this issue with a lot of books, is that the main character has very little agency. Now, the main character of this book is a late teenager, early 20s kid who is going to go off to college. He's really good at languages, and the captain of the Bounty, named Bly, comes to his house to recruit him. He is exceptional at languages, and they want to expand the Tahitian to English dictionary so that sailors, when they go to Tahiti, can speak the language better, and they'll have a guide for communication, especially when it comes to trade and things like that. And so he's invited to go on, and the main character, whose name is Bynum, he is obsessed with Captain Cook's adventures in Tahiti and the South Pacific. So he's all about it. He's really excited to go, and you get this feeling that it's going to be an adventure story with that political philosophy I mentioned earlier mixed in. The problem is, in an adventure story, it's nice to have your main character make decisions and see the consequences of that. And that never happens. And it's understandable because he's just a midshipman on this ship. He's not anything important. He has duties, and he has duties when they get to the island, but his duty at the island is to make a dictionary, which, believe it or not, is not super interesting. So all the adventure parts, which are the sailing parts, which he doesn't know much about, he never really gets to make decisions. He's just along for the ride. Now, that can be fun in certain instances. It's hard to build a whole book on that, especially the adventure parts of the book. You would rather the main character been Christian, or William Bligh, who's the captain, or someone else who makes more decisions, who actually participates in the mutiny. And it's just this person who is taken to Tahiti with some adventures, but no real decisions made by him. He makes the dictionary, they leave Tahiti, and there's a mutiny, and he doesn't participate in it, but he's not able to get on the boat. Let me explain. So when the mutiny takes place, the captain and 21 others are put on a small boat. They have to sail a very long distance, and it feels like they're basically being put in the water to their death, but they're getting an opportunity to live. And there are people on the boat who didn't participate in the mutiny but can't get on that small boat, and that is our main character is one of those people. So they try to find an island to inhabit because the leader of the mutiny, named Christian, has to find a place to settle and basically sink his own ship so that he's never caught by the English, because the English are going to come back looking for them. So you have the captain and his 21 guys off on this very exciting adventure for survival. Then you have Christian sailing around the islands of the South Pacific. He can't go back to Tahiti. But what happens is he tries to settle an island. The natives do not take kindly to him, and so he goes back to Tahiti. He drops off some of the crew members, and then him and like 9 others go, and they're going to find an island and establish a society, which is kind of interesting that they're going to establish a society. Then our character is left on Tahiti for 2 years. He meets a woman, but in a way that's kind of, again, he doesn't take much action. It sort of happens by accident, and they fall in love instantly, and he never has to earn the woman's love, and he never has to like impress a father-in-law or anything like that. It just sort of happens. And then an English boat comes. He goes out to it. The English boat is there to get the people who committed the mutiny, because you find out that Captain Bligh and his little boat, although they lost some people, most of them got back to an island and then got back to England on a Dutch East India Company ship. Not that that matters. So then our main character and a few of his friends who are still on Tahiti are taken into custody, and they're treated like they led the mutiny, which he didn't, but now he's stuck on this boat. And honestly, and I might do a show on the second part of the book, this is where the book is at its best. After he's captured, they're docked in Tahiti for a while. He is offered by the Tahitians, like some of his friends, that they'll kill everyone on board and make him escape, but he really can't do that. That's the only real decision he makes. After he decides to go on the adventure, this is the first decision he makes, and we're halfway through the book. So when the boat leaves Tahiti to go back to England, it gets wrecked on some coral reefs, and then you have a similar story of a few men trying to survive on this small boat. And most of the prisoners make it, and about half the crew of the ship taking them make it. And that is the most adventurous of the story. That it becomes a survival story to get to the same island that Captain Bligh had to get to on his small boat. But again, he has no agency. He makes no decisions in this because he is a prisoner, and they still treat him kind of like a prisoner when they're on multiple boats, actually. It's not just one boat for the prison ship. It's 4 boats, and they have to get back. Then he gets back to England. He has a trial, and his trial is basically saved from a witness of what happened who was thought to be shipwrecked, and he shows up in the last minute and saves the main character's life. And that's the book. He then has one more decision to make, whether to go back to college or go join the Navy or go to Tahiti to spend time with his wife, and he has a child in Tahiti. He decides to join the Navy again, and the Navy has treated him nothing but terrible. And again, the problem is him being the main character. there's no decisions he makes. There's no inner conflict. The inner conflict comes at the very end of the book, where he has to decide whether to say, no, fuck the Navy, or go, and they're about to fight the Napoleonic Wars, and go join the Navy. And he joins it, and you're kind of like, I don't know how he does, because I would have looked at the Navy and been like, I hope you guys lose the war and all the ships sink. But he joins, and he finally does get back to Tahiti, but it's 20 years after the fact, and a bunch of Tahitians are dead because of diseases, which happened to a lot of native people who came in contact with Europeans. So that's the whole story, and I guess I should have said spoiler. I'll put that in the description. But that's the main problem, is our main character is so boring, and he doesn't have much personality. He doesn't make many decisions. I guess it's so that you can put yourself in his shoes, but even then, the problem is, it's fun to put yourself in a character's shoes when they have a bunch of decisions to make, because then you get to turn around and say, how would I have done that differently? And there's only a few sparse moments when you get those opportunities, and they're not worth it. They're not very interesting. So that is the main problem with the book. And the other two books, which are not continuations of this story, they're then this story done by different people. It's the same type of characters. It's people who don't make the big decisions. And I'll get into that in a second, because there's an interesting story to be told, and it just never is. So, and this is the last part. This is why I won't be reading the sequels, because I just don't think they're worth it. And both stories are sort of explained at the end. And I don't like when authors tease books, or tease themes, and then don't pay them off, and then we'll pay them off later on. So as I mentioned earlier, when the mutiny happens, basically the ship's crew splits into three. 21 people and the captain go on this small boat, and you get this amazing survival story that would have been really interesting to read, and it's sort of glossed over in like a chapter, like, oh, they made it. Now that's what the second book is about, them and this amazing survival story on this small boat in the middle of the largest ocean in the world, trying to get to land and trying to survive. And cool. And you get a taste of that story in this book when the prison ship sinks and they all have to basically do the same thing on 4 small boats, is get to land and survive. So you do get a taste, and that's the best part of this book. But at this point, they're going to get there. And so you could read the second book, and you'll know that they will get back to land. And this is another failing of the book, is the captain gets on that boat and leads them to safety. There's no examination of the different types of management style between the old captain, who was a tyrant by all accounts, and the new captain, Christian, who is a more reasonable person. They're not on the boat long enough, and there's no example of, like, which leadership style works better in a pinch. And that would have been an interesting exploration that also never comes up or is never really examined. But it's a better story than the one we get in this novel. So that it's disappointing. Now, when I found out that's what the other 2 books were about, I was, make just a bit of a larger book. But I guess you can't do that. I sort of understand. It's just, the first book shouldn't be your weakest story, and it's by far the weakest and least interesting. So the other part, which this was big time teased in the first chapter, is Lieutenant Christensen, who leads the mutiny, takes the boat. He drops some people off to Tahiti, and then there are 9 people left on the main ship, the Bounty. They find an island, and they establish a society there. And in the beginning of the book, there's all this talk about Rousseau, and although they don't mention them by name, like Locke and Hobbes, which are 3 philosophers that came up around the same time and examined the building of societies. So, and I love philosophy like that. So, and this is what the third book is about, is them landing on an island and building a society. And they find the last survivor of the society 15 years after the fact, after the mutiny itself. They don't arrest him. He's found by an American ship. I'm not sure what happens to the survivor, the last survivor. I guess I could get into that. But they integrate into the natives of those islands' society, which I guess means they don't technically build their society. But even that, even them completely integrating into the native society would have been an interesting story, and it's never paid off in this book. It's never even really mentioned. And again, what I wanted out of this book was like a contrast of civilizations, a contrast of leadership styles, a contrast between a more democratic and a more tyrannical leadership in times of crisis. And none of this is really paid off. And instead, it, to me, becomes a story in which things happen and no one changes. And those, to me, are the worst types of stories. So, again, this book is readable. And if you're into adventure stories and the high seas of the turn of the 18th into 19th century, you will really like this book. That seems like a small crowd to me, but I don't know, maybe there are all sorts of people out there like this. The other thing is this is based off a real event, and the event itself is infinitely interesting. There's all sorts of documentaries on YouTube, and there are other podcasts about this specific event. I would go check it out. Just search Mutiny on the Bounty. You'll see all sorts of books, documentaries, and videos, and interesting articles about what happened and why it happened. I would say with this event, I would go with the actual history and skip the historical novelization of this event, because this book is not great. Again, readable, well-written in certain ways, but there's just no character development, not really any plot twists, and no interesting examinations of man and politics and civilization building and all that stuff I really thought I was going to get in the first chapters. So I hope you like the show. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, or comment wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm kind of open to what's going to happen next for the next show, so we'll see. I hope to get it out to you soon, though. And always, thanks for listening.